Hi all, this is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I actually want to talk about what actually comes first. Does the research question in a scientific study come first, or does the hypothesis or hypotheses, do they come first in a scientific study? So if you don't know, I'm actually a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship. And a big part of our job as people that are doing research or that are in graduate school or thinking about this kind of stuff is figuring out what you should actually talk about or how you actually structure the papers that you do, or, what is the best process to do a research study. Should you just start creating all of these hypotheses from the get-go, or should you create a research question that is, and then from there, base the hypothesis based on the research question? What I'd love to do in this video is get into why this is important and, actually give you some suggestions in why you should actually put your research question first rather than your hypothesis. So in general, a lot of people would probably agree with me, and if they're doing research, you should actually do a research question first. And the reason is a research question is some sort of problem statement that is based on the past literature or existing literature. So you want to read as much as you possibly can. That doesn't mean that you spend months and months and months and months and months reading about a particular thing. It means that you just read as much as you possibly humanly can in a given amount of period, and then come up with a research question based on that material. Right. So why is this important? Why is it important to have your research question first versus doing hypothesis first or jumping right into your hypothesis? And in fact, that's what you're going to see in most scientific studies. They're going to have a research question within the first couple of paragraphs of a scientific study. The reason is because it directs what you're going to study, and the questions that you're going to ask, or the questions you're going to ask, are basically the hypothesis that are that sort of explain this particular phenomenon or explore this particular phenomenon. So what you're trying to do with a scientific study is you're trying to falsify what existing literature says, or kind of a common assumption that is in the existing literature. You're trying to refute what they're doing. So you want to actually go through and come up with a research question that says, often, very, very often, you will find in any sort of scientific, in a bunch of journals, you'll see like contradictory evidence, or maybe evidence that's not really all that strong, or something along those lines, or maybe there's ambiguity in a particular area and people are thinking it's one thing. Your job as a researcher or a scientist or a graduate student is to go out and say, existing literature says this, but I don't believe that because X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to go out and actually try to test that and see if X, Y, and Z has sort of more validity than what existing literature says. And that's how sort of the scientific process happens, right? Or maybe there's progress that's being made. I'm not necessarily all that convinced that there's progress as most people think. So there's a stepping forward, but the ideas get sharper for sure, or we get more insight into a particular phenomenon. So the reason why you have these research questions first is because it gives you boundaries for your hypothesis, right? So if you don't know what your research question is, you don't know what the existing literature is, you're going to come up with all these kind of crazy hypotheses that kind of fit together but don't really fit together, right? So the coherence between the hypotheses are really, really important, and having a research question that's clear, that's precise, is going to limit that sort of having a smattering of different ideas all over the place that don't quite make a lot of sense. So the goal with a research question is to really direct your research as much as you possibly can, and to limit the amount of work that you're actually doing as a scientist and as a researcher or a graduate student, because you can actually go down a lot of different rabbit holes and it could consume a lot of time. But you should have your research question is going to really bound what you are going to study. So it might be very, very specific in a particular area, for example, or you might be focusing in on one particular phenomenon, and that if your research question is focused on that particular phenomenon, and some people, if the work that you're doing is a lot more empirical, you might even say in a specific context, right? So for example, you might be I'm personally interested in errors and failures and problems that happen in healthcare. And you might sort of limit your research question. So instead of just saying healthcare, because that's pretty broad, that includes like pharmaceutical firms, that includes, the regulatory agencies, that includes governments, that includes, hospitals, includes clinics. That's really, really broad. So you might have a research question, which is like, how are physicians reporting their errors that they have to the hospitals in which they work, right? So that really grounds the research question specifically. And then what that does, it allows you to say, okay, I don't have to ask all of these regulatory authorities and stuff about these particular questions. I just have to go and ask physicians. And then it also says like, okay, I'm not going to ask physicians about going into why are they having problems? For example, I'm going to ask them about the reporting patterns when they have errors, right? So that's a lot different. I'm going to see that how are they actually reporting this? And then as well, it sort of says that, okay, it's going to be in the hospital context. I don't have to go into all these different areas. I just have to ask physicians, not in a sort of a clinical, or maybe it's not so for example, it's not in their sort of daily practice, but it's within the hospital setting. So I just have to go ask physicians within hospitals, which it seems like really specific and nitty gritty and whatnot, but it really makes your life a lot easier in terms of focusing where you want to go, because then it's still a really big area to investigate, right? So there's a lot of hospitals, and there's lots of different kinds of hospitals around the world. So you then as well, you might even limit it to, okay, I'm going to ask these physicians and hospitals within Canada or within the Southeast United States or within Georgia. And then we're going to get even smaller. And then that still the sample is still rather big that you're going to have to pull from, or the population is rather big that you're going to have to pull a sample from. So, there's lots of benefits, right? This in terms of focusing what you're trying to do, and having that research question that's focusing allows you to come up with a coherent set of hypotheses that can try to refute what you're trying to say. So the research question in that case, it might be that people are, maybe the existing literature says that physicians report everything that they actually have. Well, that's not true. And there's been some research studies in this area that have shown that it's not true, that, they actually only report a very small problem, very, very tiny amount of problems that they experience. And, it might be the case that's the study, right? So we know that physicians should be actually reporting all the problems that they experience, because it benefits society as a whole, and we can sort of the hospitals can sort of solve these problems, but can make these problems a little bit more known. But we're going to go and see what the reporting patterns actually are for physicians. We believe that they should be reporting everything, but let's go in and see what's actually going on with physicians. And then when we go and explore that and test that, we find out that they actually are not reporting everything that they possibly can report, and they only report a small amount. So that's really cool, right? So that's the important thing. So having that focused research question is going to really ground what you're trying to do, and it's going to limit what you're trying to do, and it's going to give you a lot of coherence between your hypotheses, because then you can pick a couple of hypotheses that sort of really test that particular research question, right? So that really explore what's going on, and instead of having all these hypotheses that are all over the place, this limits what you're going to ask, and then you're going to have a lot more coherence in the hypothesis that you actually have to do. So in general, the long story short, the reason why you want to have your research question first, and really think hard about a research question, and it's going to so I also want to point out, it's going to evolve, right? So when you actually do your research question, the first time you actually go and do that particular study, or you actually start investigating it, doing preliminary research, you're going to find out that that research question was too broad. I almost guarantee it. That always happens. And then you're going to have to go and refine it and focus a little bit more. And you're going to have to keep doing that until you come up with something that's a lot more specific and a lot more fine-grained. And it happens to everybody. It's totally normal. And just expect that that's going to happen, right? So in general, what it's doing, it's limiting the amount of work that you have to do. You have limited resources, and you want to focus your time and effort as much as you possibly can on this earth, right? And that's really what it's doing. So even scientists and researchers actually have limited time to sort of explore different things. So we want to make sure that it's as narrow as possible, because if it's like this really big, broad project, you're going to be there for 65 years. And then you're not going to make any progress on the thing that you're doing. So you need to limit it and make sure that your research question is very specific. And that's why we always typically have a research question first. It's why in any scientific article, we're going to have research questions first. It's why when scientists actually go and do something, or a researcher actually goes and does something, they're going to ask a research question first that's based on the existing literature. Then they're going to dream up these hypotheses going forward. So if you like this video, make sure you give me a thumbs up. I do appreciate it. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. And this is part of my Nerd Out Wednesday series, where I talk about things that I find interesting in science. If there's any questions, you can always ask me, and I'd be happy to answer them. All right, take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.